Okay, we're here today with Dr. Victor Sower and Dr. Frank Fair, and we're going to talk about their book. One of the first things that I would like to do is ask Vic and Frank to tell us a little bit about themselves. Vic, would you like to go first?
Sure. I graduated from Virginia Tech with a degree in chemistry and worked as a chemist for about 6 months. I also graduated from there with a commission in the Army and spent a couple of years on active duty. When I came out of the Army, back into industry in research and development for about 10 years, along the way picking up my MBA. Then moved on to general manager of a manufacturing division of a large corporation. Then I decided that I had a calling to be a teacher, so I went back and got my doctorate at North Texas and came to Sam Houston in 1990 and taught here until 2008, at which time I retired.
Frank, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I was originally going to be a physics major, and in my senior year of high school, I had an English teacher who had a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame. And he had us read some books, including the Brothers Karamazov. And I read a sentence in there, "If God is dead, then everything is lawful." And I thought, that can't be right. But I had no clue about how to go about figuring out whether that was right or wrong. And what I did know is physics didn't address that sort of question at all. So that told me I had questions. I still loved physics. I loved the idea of getting down to the sort of the roots of things. But I knew there were issues in religion and ethics that I was also concerned about. And of course, given that my teacher had a PhD in philosophy, he could tell me, you need to study philosophy. So I had a really straightforward academic career. I went to Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, majored in philosophy and classical languages. After 4 years there, went to Boston College, got a master's degree in philosophy from Boston College. But at that point, I sort of jumped ship. I was in the PhD program at Boston College, and I didn't really feel I was going the right place. So a friend of mine had gone to the University of Georgia, so I went there, finished the doctorate in 1971, and lo and behold, there was a job at a place called Sam Houston State University. When I visited here, I was expecting, of course, the desert stretching out to nowhere and oil wells and so on. I was greatly relieved driving up I-45 to see the pine trees and the rolling hills. So I came here in '71, been here ever since. Have not yet retired, though that's a lot closer than it once was. In that time, I've taught philosophy courses of a variety of sorts and managed to have my hand in a lot of different things around the university, like the honors program.
Mm-hmm. Would the two of you discuss how this collaboration came about between the two of you?
Well, Frank and I worked together on a lot of things, the honors program, other committees. We go to the same church, so we knew each other pretty well. I teach a class, or used to teach a class in quality management, and I'm active in the quality profession. And there's an active discussion even today on what do we mean by quality? How do we actually judge characteristics of an individual, a product, or a service and determine that one is better quality than the other? So I've been thinking about that and trying to come up with a way to address that with a research project. And I was walking through the library, and I usually stop at the new acquisitions area, and I found a new translation of Plato that I had not read before. So I took it down, opened it up to the dialogue Greater Hippias. And I read through that, and I said, Socrates was asking the same question in this dialogue that I'm trying to address right now. And if you know about Socratic dialogue, Socrates is much better at asking questions than he is answering the questions. He didn't exactly resolve the issue. So I said, I have to find somebody that I can talk to about this. So who better than a philosopher who can perhaps answer Socrates' question, what is quality?
Well, on the other side then, this really begins for me with my daughter Joanna. She was getting her PhD in chemical physics at the University of Colorado, and she talked about how she and her mentor, David Nesbitt, would read papers and preprints of papers and so forth, and some would be, interesting, and others would be, and her phrase was, lacking insight. They might be sort of good technically, but, there really wasn't anything interesting going on there. And for some reason that triggered in me a sort of reflection on an image that Plato had used, which is the image of the divided line. And the idea is there's a kind of ascent in levels of knowing. And at the top, the usual translation is something like reason. But I thought, you know, what's really going on, because Plato's describing something that he was familiar with the mathematicians and scientists of his time. So I said, really, the top part of that is insight. And what's it insight into? Well, his phrase for it was the form of the good. Gee, that sounds like innate excellence and quality. So I started talking with Vic about this, and it was like, aha, maybe there's something there that's worth pursuing. Just a little brief reprise, the idea is that you can get, my example was knowledge in chemistry. You can read a chemistry textbook. You might even be able to memorize it, but you're still not much of a chemist. Then you get into the laboratory, so you've got hands-on, real-world experience. That's important. But then you'd better be able to extract from that the sort of general principles like Boyle's law and so on. Then the top thing is being able to come up with new hypotheses that are worth testing. And since Vic was trained as a chemist, I think that resonated with him, and so that gave us some promise that maybe there was something here worth developing.
So we agreed to meet at a coffee shop near campus that no longer exists, Caldy's Coffee Shop. And that one meeting turned into, about every week we would sit there and we would talk about things. And we were going along the lines of developing a history of the development of the concept of quality. And as we got further and further into it, we decided that wasn't really what we wanted to do. We wanted to look at the concept of insight as it relates to quality and what quality really is, not so much how it developed over the years, not a historical discussion of the development of the concept, but what is it now and how can we make use of that? So it turned into a much deeper discussion about something a bit different than what we either had thought we were going to do in the beginning. And that turned into a paper that we submitted to a journal, and they accepted that paper and actually made that the highlight paper in that particular issue. And we got a lot of good feedback about that.
That's the 2005 Quality Management Journal, issue number 1, just to be a little bit of a plug, because that was one of the things we found was that Plato had actually, of course, in Greek, invented the term quality, which then got translated into Latin by Cicero as qualitas and then into English eventually. And so that was, again, one of those little sort of like a sign that maybe, you know, you're on the right track to something. And then when Vic showed me these attempts to define quality in the 20th century, and one attempt in particular, the transcendent approach, would get mentioned, but then kind of dismissed as, well, you know, not of much use. And so what we set out to do was say, well, perhaps this transcendent notion of quality, which is similar to what Plato was talking about, might actually be one of the most important ways to try to understand quality. And of course, if you think of quality on the one side as the thing known, insight then as the act of knowing, it became pretty obvious to us that we were going to make a transition from quality as something grasped by insight to then, well, what happens if you'd like to gain insight? You know, how would you construct an organization to make it insightful? So the paper was really the germ that out of which sprouted the book.
And given that Caldy's had closed, we had to move our venue, so we now, every other Thursday, pretty much on a regular basis, we meet at the Tokyo Grill over a bento box and discuss concepts, and that's where the book was written, actually.
And for guys who are writing about innovation, we would typically have the same bento box every time.
Exactly. In fact, we don't even have to order when we go in. They bring us.
Yes.
We don't get very creative with our selection of menus.
No.
But one point in the book that I'll make mention of here, we talk about serendipity and sagacity. Serendipity being defined as a fortunate accident. Well, people have accidents all the time. But what does it take to turn that accident into an opportunity to gain insight into something? And that's the sagacity. You have to be prepared. So finding that book in the library was a serendipitous thing. It was an accident. I didn't go over there with the intention of doing that. Our collaboration, in some sense, was serendipitous in that I just wanted some explanation about how to interpret this dialogue. But it developed into so much more because I think we were both prepared to address a deeper issue. You know, what is quality? Is quality just about continuous improvement, or is quality about something much deeper than that? And our premise is that it's something much deeper than that.
Okay. Okay, so was there any other motivation for writing this book?
Well, as you well know, since we've collaborated on a book as well, academic books don't sell like Lord of the Rings and, you know, those types of books. So money is not the primary motivation for doing this. It's the opportunity to be able to put together a story, if you will, with a plot, with characters in that, but that has a very deep message, a message that you feel passionate about. And I think Frank and I both felt passionate about this message. And the book gave us an opportunity to put those ideas together and offer that to publishers and let them look at it. They send it out to reviewers, and we get feedback from that we believe that you've told a story that's worth publishing so that other people can see it. So that's external validation of the ideas that we were putting together. And then to be able to put it out there so that faculty can use that and practitioners can use that, hopefully will increase the quality of everything that we encounter in the world.
I would add that it's a kind of truism that for knowledge workers, which would include all of us here, one of the best things about being a knowledge worker that keeps people at it is associating with people whose work and whose values and whose opinions that they esteem. And so working with Vic was in itself its own reward. I mean, we did finally produce a book, and that's great. My parents often told me I should write a book, and I always said, when I have something to say, I will. But working with Vic, the process itself, with all of its false starts and its redoing things and so forth, was something that I very much enjoyed. So, in a sense, the book was just one of those natural fruits of a collaboration that was a collaboration of equals. Although he didn't write most of it. More words came out of his word processor than mine. But neither of us would have written the book without the other. And so I think, to my mind, that in a sense it demonstrates actually the value for innovation of being able to interact with people whose insights and opinions and so forth you really have. You don't have to share exactly, but you have to respect.
Well, yeah, that certainly respect. But another aspect of that is that if you look at our academic backgrounds, it would be difficult to find two more diverse individuals than the two of us: philosophy and the sciences and business. And that enabled us to do a better job writing the book, I think. If you get together with people who have entirely different perspectives on an issue than you have, and you discuss those and you talk about them, ideally over a bento box or a cup of cappuccino or a cup of coffee, it's amazing what will come out of that. Things come out of that either one of us acting individually would never be able to do. It's that collaboration of two perspectives or more that actually generates something that has real value to it, in my opinion.
Okay. I would like, I know, Frank, that you mentioned Plato's divided line earlier. Would you mind, the both of you, expanding on your use of Plato's hierarchy?
Yeah, let me just try to describe the illustration. All right. You take a line, make it a vertical line. Cut the line in half, and then cut each half. So now you have 4 parts. And the idea is, on one side of the line, there are the things known, the objects of knowledge. On the other side of the line are the corresponding forms of awareness. And you start from the bottom, which Plato liked to think of images. And that was all sorts of things, like it could be reflections in the water. So you know these things, but they're kind of fleeting, they're insubstantial. Still, you can know them. Well, then you move up next to objects, ordinary everyday objects, and you have perceptual awareness of those. They're a little firmer, a little more real. Right? Then the next step is to see the patterns in operation. So you don't just encounter the physical objects, but you see how they interact with each other. You notice the patterns of the seasons and all that. And then It's the form of the good, as it's called, or the good in and of itself, and then insight. So when we were looking at that, that's what triggered this notion that maybe we could look at the literature on defining quality and say this hierarchy illustrates some things that when you take it seriously, maybe a kind of an opening to a better reconceptualization of what we're about when we're trying to think about quality in a serious way.
We put a lot of illustrations in the book. And one of our thoughts that comes from the divided line is that if you're not at the insight level, if you're at the understanding level or one of the lower levels in the hierarchy, it's unlikely that you're going to be the one that develops the next new paradigm. The iPod did not come out of a process that included only people at the level of understanding. Someone had the insight to be able to say there is a need that has not been expressed. There is technology that maybe hasn't been applied in this area. If we put this technology together with some other technologies that have never been married together before, we're going to be able to create a need for a product that people won't be able to do without. That's insight. That's a practical illustration of insight, I think. And we use Steve Jobs several times in the book as an example of an insightful individual. Someone who prided himself on not just giving customers what they wanted, but providing customers with things that they found that they needed once he had developed the particular product.
And if I can add, there's a bridge here with the creative arts. One of my main sources of inspiration was a choreographer named Twyla Tharp, because she had to routinely produce works that would satisfy an audience, but also would challenge an audience, would be contrary to expectations perhaps. And she has some wonderful descriptions of how she goes about doing things. I mean, one of her little phrases that I like is, you can't think outside the box until you have a box. Because she literally carried around a number of boxes with ideas for various performances. So I think there's a nice interaction here with people who are creative novelists, choreographers, and the like. In part, when we get to talking a little bit about the personal characteristics that go with an insightful individual, one of them is the ability to fail. And fail maybe routinely, but you got to fail in a way that's productive, that you can make use of. And I think that's where people in the arts often have that experience, and have those that are truly creative are able to surmount it and keep on producing things that are worthwhile.
Would you relate Plato's hierarchy to the approaches that you use for defining quality? I believe it was Garvin's approaches.
Well, Frank's already introduced the transcendent approach. And the transcendent approach basically says that there is an innate attribute of an object. It doesn't lend itself very well to being measured or a service. It doesn't have to be just an object, but Garvin's dimensions do apply strictly to products. But there is this difficult to measure concept, the transcendent approach. It's almost like you know quality when you see it, but it's hard to define exactly what it was. And it was that thing that Socrates was so uncomfortable with. He had just listened to Hippias, the sophist, deliver an oration, and he said that wasn't a very good oration. That was a poor quality oration. And then he sat back and said, well, how did I arrive at that judgment? You know, what was the basis for my determining that that was a poor quality presentation? And he had difficulty answering that, so he went to the sophist who knows everything, and he says, well, what is quality? And the sophist offers an answer. He says that's an easy thing to answer, and he offers an answer. Then Socrates immediately shoots that one down and asks the question again. And that goes on for a while, and as I said before, he never really answers the question of what that is. But I would suggest that insight relates to the transcendent approach to quality. The other approaches to quality that we talk about in the book have to do with things that are much more easily measured. Does it conform to specifications, for example? So we're looking at engineering specifications, and they list height, weight, length, width, clock speed, all sorts of things. And we can measure those and compare those to the specifications and see whether or not we meet specifications. But Frank and I quickly discovered that if we were talking about, let's say, a slide rule, which your students won't know probably what that is, but it was the device that I used when I was an engineer in the 70s to crunch numbers. If you compare the slide rule to its specifications, you have a very high quality slide rule. Unfortunately, you won't be able to sell that slide rule because in today's world it does not have quality as a number processor. What has quality as a number processor is a computer, which displaced the slide rule and pocket calculators. So conformance to specifications doesn't necessarily mean that you have a high quality product. So we went from that end of the spectrum to the insightful level saying, well, what is it then? If that doesn't do it, what is it then that does define quality? And that's where we got in some deep philosophical discussions. And I'm afraid, like Socrates, we perhaps have not answered all of them. The idea behind this book is not for it to be prescriptive, to provide all the answers to these questions, but to help people in business and in the academic world to begin asking the right kinds of questions and to begin thinking about things in different ways and to come up with some of their own conclusions about what's insightful and what will work, not to tell them precisely what it is.
Because in a sense, Socrates' real strength was to try to unsettle people, to say, you have the conventional ways you're thinking about things, but here's a challenge to them. Now, if I, Socrates, am not going to be able to hand you the answer, I can at least make you aware of what you really don't know. And I think we don't really want to denigrate the ordinary sort of quality management tools. I mean, they're essential, really. This is just to say you shouldn't rest content with those approaches to quality. And having a sense that there's a transcendent notion of quality, we think sort of fuels the discontent with the routine.
I also consult in the quality area. And it's interesting, sometimes with clients, I will go in and I'll say, how is the quality of this particular product? And they say, well, it's excellent. I say, well, how do you know that? And they say, well, here are the specifications. Here's the product that meets specifications. I say, well, how do you know that that makes that product high quality? Well, our customers tell us this is what they want. How do you know that your customers know what to ask for? Because when the slide rule was displaced by the pocket calculator, it wasn't because customers were saying, we need something better than the slide rule. They were saying, we need a better slide rule. So had the slide rule manufacturers, which they actually did, listened to their customers, they kept working to develop a better slide rule with blinders on so that they didn't see what was happening in the electronics field. And what happened in that field was the creation of a product that put them totally out of business.
Okay. Let's see. At what point in the product life cycle should organizations then begin to explore new features or new possible products?
Well, when I worked in the real world, I worked in the magnetic media industry. And our most formidable competitor was the 3M company. I worked for Ampex Corporation. Ampex Corporation had invented videotape recording. 3M also produced competitive products. And they had gotten ahead of us, of Ampex, in this particular area. And I worked in research and development. One of my jobs was to develop the next generation of videotape products that were used in all the network facilities and all of the local network television stations. So I would work on that, and we would take our new product to the National Association of Broadcasters shows to demonstrate that. Big splash, big party for all the potential customers. And I would go as the technical representative to answer technical questions about the products. And I can remember one memorable NAB in Houston in the early 70s. We had worked years developing a brand new videotape product that would leapfrog anything out there at the present time. We took it to the convention. The first day of the convention, lots of excitement in the booth about that product. The 3M booth, they had their regular products and very few people there. The next day, 3M had a product that leapfrogged ours that was much better than our brand new product. And now all the attention shifted over there. So I would suggest that the right time to think about the next generation of product is as you're developing the current generation of product. So in the introduction phase, you're developing this new product, but you're thinking, what will the next generation look like? All the way, if you wait until the growth phase or maturity, saturation, and decline, you're going to be left behind. You have to be thinking about these things on a concurrent basis, all the way through the life cycle.
Okay, all right. Are there indicators that the company should watch for paradigm shifts, other companies?
I don't think there's a pat answer to that. It's easy to forecast things in the past. If you listen to economists and if you listen to stockbrokers, they can always tell you why the economy did what it did in the past. They can always tell you why the stock market did what it did yesterday. They're much less able to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And in fact, some might say their accuracy right there is abysmal. It's similar in this case. How do you forecast something for which there's no precedent? So I would suggest it's the idea, the insightful idea. Part of the insightful idea is being open to all sorts of stimuli. Robinson and Stern, whom we incorporate their ideas into the body of the book. One of their 6 dimensions of a creative organization is diverse stimuli. And we suggest in our book that in order not to be blindsided by a new paradigm that might replace your product completely, you need to have someone in the organization, preferably many people in the organization, who read widely, who stay aware of what's going on throughout all the technologies, not just the ones that they're involved with. They should be reading things like Scientific American. They should be reading, the slide rule manufacturers should have been reading that. They should have been reading IEEE transactions. They should have been reading all these other things. But I have the sense that they were sitting back saying, we're not in the electronics industry. Why waste our time and our money looking at that? We're in the slide rule business. We should be investigating better ways to make slide rules. That paradigm came along and blindsided them. That's not the only way, though, that you can be blindsided by a paradigm. Kodak actually invented digital photography. They, for over 100 years, were the premier emulsion technology photographic company in the world. They dominated the market and were able to fend off competitors like Fuji and others who would come in with their products. They invented it but did not see the value of it. They were so wedded to the emulsion technology, emulsion photographic technology, that they failed to see that that was going to be replaced by digital photography. After all, they had successfully fended off other instant photography techniques like the Polaroid land process. That a minor player, didn't threaten their business a bit. They actually didn't take advantage of that technology, and today they're in bankruptcy because they only realized the value of digital technology after many other companies had established their leadership position in the market, and it was way too late for them to catch up. They are closing down their emulsion photography business, and they have a very limited array of digital photography products out there that really don't make much sense for them. They're not a major player in that market. So they're blindsided by a technology that they developed but failed to have the insight to recognize the value of.
I'd like to add to that I think it's important, if you're now thinking about not just individuals but groups and organizations, one of the things you want is diversity within the group. I mean, it's an obvious thing you would imagine, but you want diversity so that you've got people, in a sense, what they're doing is exploring a multidimensional shifting map. And you want people that are adventurous, that are, willing to go outside their comfort zone, and they'll attend a concert of a musician that they don't really know much about. But who knows? They may pick up something in that. So I think that's we used one example, I did, from the development of the Mars rover by NASA. The person who led the team made it a point to get people of diverse personalities as part of her creative group, because she thought, what one wouldn't notice, another would. What one wouldn't come up with, another would. So I think that really is, to me, it's crucial, is to be able to sort of hang with diverse folks whom you respect, who are passionate about what they do, and who are willing to be the explorers into this terrain that's not only is it unmarked to start with, but it's constantly shifting.
I think this is probably a good time to talk about Richard Bozeman and his device. Would you mind telling that story, Vic?
Sure. Probably 15 years ago, a couple moved into a house across the street from us here in Huntsville. And he was a retired NASA engineer, a very nice guy. We got to be very good friends. He had in his garage a very nice metalworking shop. I had in my garage a very nice woodworking shop. So we often would find ourselves in each other's shops working on projects together and talking about things. He holds probably 50 patents that are crucial to NASA's efforts from the Apollo projects through the space shuttle, and probably some are still being used today. He could do almost anything in his shop. We would sit around and we would dream up things, and the next day he would have a prototype over there that he had made. So he was very creative and very innovative and very good at what he did. And he told me a story about his most recent patent. He told me this story just as he went down to be honored as being part of this. NASA was contacted by Dr. DeBakey, who's the noted heart surgeon, and was asked for some engineering assistance in developing a left ventricular assist device, which is a small device that goes in prior to the heart, and if the patient doesn't have enough strength in the heart to pump the blood, this left ventricular assist device would provide a little extra pressure and help pump that blood and help the weak heart. It wasn't an artificial heart in that it replaced the human heart, it was an addition to that. So NASA assigned Bozeman to go talk to DeBakey to see what they might be able to do. And he met with DeBakey and he began asking questions. And the first question he asked was, why does a heart have to beat? And DeBakey said that at that point he wasn't sure that this collaboration was a good idea, because everybody knows why a heart has to beat. But Bozeman's philosophy was that the only way to get started with a new project is to ask childish questions, to be sure that you understand as much as possible. You start off maybe with beginning to develop an understanding, get up to that level, and then you can start becoming insightful. But you have to go through the divided line there. So he started out asking the childish questions to get at the images level of this thing. DeBakey humored him, answered his questions, and they developed a collaboration where it turned out that the device they developed didn't beat. It was a continuous operation system, which DeBakey had anticipated it was going to be a pulsating system that would pulsate in sync with the heart. So it was an entirely innovative approach to a left ventricular assist device, something that had never been come up with in the medical realm. But Bozeman thought, all you have to do, he thought like an engineer, all you have to do is increase the static pressure going in, and that's going to improve the flow. And they had a few minor things to overcome, things like the first impellers that they tried destroyed all the blood corpuscles, so they had to come up with an impeller design that would not harm the corpuscles. And the second thing was, since it's going to be implanted, they had to get power to it, and they came up with they did not want to have wires going in, so they came up with a radio frequency device that would take power from a battery and transmit it to the device and cause it to run. They also didn't want to have it bring it out and put oil on the bearings and put it back in very often, so they came up with a bearing. And there's a story, I think I invented this story because I introduced him at a conference one time, and I think I invented this story as part of the introduction. But his wife told me later that this very well could have happened, that they were walking in the Galleria area together, and they passed a jewelry store, and he stopped and looked in the window, and there were these beautiful diamond rings in the window. And he was looking at them, and she could tell he was very intent. And she thought, well, he might be buying me a diamond ring. So she gets closer to him and takes his hand and says, "A penny for your thoughts." And he said, "Well, I was just thinking that a diamond would make a perfect bearing surface for the left ventricular assist device." And in fact, that's what they developed. They developed a diamond, which is very hard. The coefficient of friction was such that it would work very well, and it would never have to be replaced. So he's one of the co-inventors on the patent. There are other NASA engineers who were involved, other physicians who were involved, And DeBakey gets the credit. I think it's called the DeBakey Heart Assist device. But it was a collaborative effort, and it was a very diverse collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Let's see.
We should have put that in the book.
Yes,
Actually.
it's been good, yes.
The sequel.
How are the tools of quality and insight related?
Well, if you look at the 7 tools of quality, which are typically the first ones that a student learns or a practitioner learns, they're specifically designed for continuous improvement activities. But with an insightful perspective, you can adapt those and use those also for more fundamental work in the quality field. Let me take one of the tools that we talk about in the book, not one of the 7 tools, but another tool that's consistently rated as the most useful quality tool by practitioners, and that's quality function deployment, or the house of quality. In the less than insightful application of that tool, one goes out and elicits information from potential customers or current customers about what they would like to see in the product. So we're offering a pocket calculator. You ask customers, what would you like to see in the next generation of pocket calculators? And you take good notes about all that, and you record all of that in the left-hand side of the house of quality. Then you translate that into technical specifications and technical ideas, and you do it in such a way that you make sure that you've addressed every one of the customer concerns. When you get through, you then have a product that you know is going to meet customer expectations for the next generation. That's terrific. Nice continuous improvement application of this. Steve Jobs says that's not the way we do things. Steve Jobs said, an insightful individual I might point out, Steve Jobs said, what is it that if customers had it available, would they highly value? They don't know anything. If I go out and ask them, what would you like to see in the next generation computer? They wouldn't know what to tell you. So you have to know your technology, and you have to know what's possible and what possible uses can be made of that technology so that you can come up with the next new product. If you remember, Apple Computer wasn't immediately successful. Started by Jobs and Wozniak in a garage. And they were looking around the Apple I, Apple II. I mean, it had its place, but the IBM PC and other, it was just one in a whole array of computers at that time. Computers did not come with mouses. They didn't come with those things that we use to move the cursor around. Jobs happened to go to a technology fair at Xerox Corporation, at Xerox PARC. And they had a computer there that they designed a mouse for. And he looked at that and he said, you know, we can use that in our computers. Not a single customer said, give us a mouse. He brought it back, put it on there, and began marketing that. And the Apple became the computer to have if you're doing graphics, because it was so easy to manipulate things on the screen. So the graphical user interface mouse technology came out of that chance encounter and Jobs' insight into this being valuable. Well, the IBM community laughed at that for a long while. But now every Windows product uses the graphical user interface mouse technology. That came about by Steve Jobs in that chance encounter at Xerox PARC. Jobs later said that if Xerox had known what they had and built on that and marketed it, they would have put all of us out of business. They would be the dominant computer manufacturing organization today.
By the way, I thought that was one of the strong points of the book, because, you know, when talking with Vic over time, this issue did arise naturally. Well, you're going to be an insightful individual, you're going to be an insightful organization, so now what? And one of the things, insight with maybe a small I, was to say you can take the standard quality tools, but you can use them with a different attitude, a different frame of mind, in such a way that you can increase the chances of getting hold of those innovations that you need to get hold of in a timely fashion. So I think that for users, for readers of the book and so forth, I think that'll provide a kind of a nice bridge to begin to really take seriously the frame of mind that we'd like to encourage them to have.
The futurist Joel Barker likes to say that a fundamental question one needs to ask is, what is it that is impossible to do today, that if it were possible, would fundamentally change the way you do business? That's an insightful question. So if you're flowcharting a process or you're documenting a process in some way using one of the tools of quality, and you're doing that with an idea of identifying areas where you can tweak it here, tweak it there, make a little continuous improvement, that's very important work. We're not suggesting that you stop doing that. That's an appropriate use of tools of quality. We desperately need that to occur by all organizations today. But someone needs to be asking that fundamental question and taking those same tools and saying, instead of making this minor improvement, what do we need to do to take this step function up and make this big improvement? Take the whole performance of this class of product to an entirely new level. That's the new paradigm that's up there. And that's where you get to when you ask Barker's question, that fundamental question.
Okay, thank you. Why and when is time series forecasting not appropriate for technology forecasting?
Well, time series forecasting has several assumptions, the most important of which is that it assumes that whatever created variation in whatever parameter you're trying to forecast in the past will continue to do so in the same way in the future. So if you're looking at demand for slide rules, what creates demand for slide rules? Well, technological development. We were in the space race in the 60s. It was one of the Cold War strategies to outcompete the Soviet Union in science and technology. So more and more people were going to universities to major in science, engineering, things like that. So every scientist, every engineer needed at least one slide rule. I had 3 when I was an undergraduate. Depending on the complexity of the exam, I was going to have to take which one I took. So if you look at that and you say, okay, we can forecast demand for slide rules in the future by just looking at how many scientists and engineering majors there are in universities. And you get this nice extrapolation out. But if the technology paradigm shifts to where it's now possible to get an electronic pocket calculator that you put the numbers in and you can get exact values back. A slide rule only gives you approximate values. There's a lot of work involved with using a slide rule. It gives you approximate values. The calculator gives you exact values. If that were to come about, it would fundamentally change the way we do business, and instead of continuing to grow like this, demand for our product will drop like a hot rock. And the new product will begin taking over. It took just a matter of a couple of years for the slide rule manufacturers to decline to the point where it was no longer economical for them to stay in business. They simply weren't selling product. The only place you can find slide rules today is if you find an old engineer like me, or you look on eBay under antiques. They have no value in the science field at all. So you can't forecast using time series techniques things like that. Things that are those paradigm shifts you cannot forecast. If you even have less dramatic paradigm shifts where some new technology comes into the market, it's going to change the slope of your line in an unpredictable way, an unforecastable way. Your time series forecast will always seriously lag technological shifts. And that's where the problem comes in. The part of your organization that's tasked with marketing the existing products and producing the existing products should make extensive use of time series forecasting. The part of the organization that's involved with where are we going to be in the future, strategic planning part of the organization, the research and development part of the organization, the growth part of the organization, how do you manage growth, that part cannot rely on time series forecasting because the data aren't there to support that type of technology, that type of forecasting. And you have to use qualitative techniques by and large, which involves, as I said before, reading very widely, associating with a very diverse group, attending conferences that don't appear to have any implications for your current business, trying to understand what's going on in the world that we can take advantage of, collaborations with universities, bringing universities into your research efforts, just sitting down with people and having conversations with people like Frank and I do can enable you to gain insight into things that are going on in areas that you ordinarily wouldn't encounter. And that then can generate ideas in your business where you can take that paradigm up. You can be the one taking the paradigm up. You're not reacting to it. The person who gets there first is going to have a fundamental advantage in the market. Everybody else is going to try and catch up to them.
I'd like to just sort of bounce a thought off of Vic. Vic, in talking about that, you distinguish sort of two components of the organization. The marketing folk and the folk that were involved in innovation. And since this is a book for managers, it struck me, even hearing you talk, that it's part of the job of the alert manager to try to make sure that the folks that are in charge with innovation aren't sort of hamstrung by giving dominance to the folk that are doing the time series forecasting, which needs to be done, but it could, in some organizations, become a kind of constraint that says, well, we know what the future is going to be, so everybody has to conform to what we know the future is going to be, and of course at that point you're at least setting yourself up for some severe problems.
No, you're exactly right. And it's the role of top management to make sure that that balance exists. I can remember a meeting, when I was general manager of an organization, I had marketing, human resources, manufacturing, research and development, the whole organization reported to me. And we were in a staff meeting with my 7 direct reports. And I had just finished discussing, I won't say chewing out, I was discussing with the manufacturing manager why there were so many mistakes being made and what can we do to eliminate those mistakes. And trying to encourage him to set a higher priority on minimizing those mistakes. I then turn to the research and development manager and I say, you're not making enough mistakes. And I look at the manufacturing manager, he looks at me and says, is this the same person that I just had a conversation with? Well, if your research and development group is not making mistakes, they're not reaching out far enough. And if they don't reach out far enough, you're not going to be at the head of the pack. You have to encourage them to go beyond their comfort zones, to really reach out there. And that's a top management responsibility to be sure that there is balance. On a different level, but that relates to that, I'm involved with a conversation on LinkedIn right now. It's the Quality Management Division of the American Society for Quality discussion. Someone started the discussion by saying, do standard operating procedures inhibit creativity within an organization? And the first responses to that from the practitioner community were, oh, absolutely, everybody has to conform to the standard. And my response is, heck no, they don't. What you do is you use that creativity to come up with new ideas. You turn those into innovations, which are the commercialization of the creative ideas. You turn those into products and services. Then you standardize the way you produce those, because you don't want to get one iPad and I get a different iPad and you get a different iPad. You have to have standard operating procedures to ensure that there's very little variation in the manufacture of that. So you create standard operating procedures. Those are the natural evolution or the natural endpoint of the creative process. You've taken it through to innovation and now you've standardized it and that's what you're producing. Now you're off looking at what's next. And even at the operating level, the manufacturing employees who are doing the work, you want to encourage them to question the procedures in the standing operating procedures. If they have a creative idea for doing something better, and they very likely might be the ones most likely to come up with that because they do this every day. You want them not to change what they do, continue to do it by the SOP, but to let enlightened management know there's a better way of doing this, I think. So management can now institute a project to see if it is better, and indeed if it is, we change the standing operating procedure. So the standard operating procedure is important to reduce variation in the manufacture of products and the delivery of services. And if properly used within an organization, it by no means decreases creativity or innovation.
It occurred to me, I'm listening to Vic and thinking, there's kind of an analogy that struck me. It's kind of like asking with regard to scientific ideas, should we not have standard ways of testing scientific ideas? Well, of course, you have to have standard ways of testing to ascertain whether the value you think is in those ideas really is in the ideas. So Yeah, the idea that there's an inherent conflict between standard operating procedures, so it probably is at best a kind of oversimplification of the situation, and I think Vic describes really nicely from my standpoint the need to think more, in a sense, more realistically about the relationship between those things. And that's part of what we try to encourage. It's not that the standardized continuous improvement techniques are somehow wrong or bad. They're absolutely essential. They're just not the whole story. And it's important that they're not the whole story.
Well, I have one last question for the two of you. If I were a student sitting in your classes and I was tasked with doing a technology forecast for an existing product that had been used in a different way, where would you tell me to begin?
This is an interesting question.
It really is.
Because Pam was a student in my technology and innovation management class, and one of her assignments was to do a technological forecast. You choose the technology. Where is this technology going to be 5 and 10 years into the future? What advice did I give you then about where to go?
You told us to go to the magazines and look and see what was going on, to look at what industry was doing, so to do an environmental scan.
Okay, that's the first part. What else did I tell you to do?
Gosh, it's been so
This is
long
an
ago.
oral exam.
This has been so long ago, I've forgotten.
Okay, the other thing was to identify who's doing cutting edge research. Not necessarily in that particular technology, but who's doing cutting edge research, and contact them and ask them how that research applies to the technology that you're thinking about. And if they won't talk to you, and sometimes they wouldn't, ask to speak to the next person down in the list. But don't give up. Stay with that company. And I've had students who talked, not with Steve Jobs, but with Steve Jobs, the technology, I don't remember the title, but it was a direct report to Steve Jobs, who was tasked with developing the technologies. So it's not as impossible a task as students think. You know, I'm going to call Steve Jobs, and he's going to talk to me about, you know, where the computing industry is going to be in 10 years. It's not as impossible a job as you might think.
In fact, I would be willing to bet that a lot of people in that second or third tier actually are quite happy that somebody is taking an interest, somebody's willing to say, you know, I think you've got a perspective, given your situation in the organization, that is worthwhile.
It's interesting that I've had students who, before the era of research, radio frequency identification technologies, before that was really well known, one of them decided they were going to do a technology forecast for the kitchen of the future. And I thought, well, it's not exactly the kind of technology I had in mind, but okay, if that's what you want to do, do it. They came up with this doorless refrigerator, and it was self-replenishing. That when you put something in, the computer knew that you'd put that in and what it was. When you took it out, it knew you had taken it out, and when you put it back in, it had a sensor in there that would determine how much of it you'd used. And it would automatically send a message to the store to replenish the stock, and that would arrive by mail or something. It would arrive, and they would replenish your refrigerator. They came up with that idea. What do we have now? Your smart shelf in the lab, RFID, and it monitors the things in exactly the way those students had come up with there. I've had other students from 10 years ago who forecast what was going to happen 10 years in the future, and they were remarkably good at forecasting where that technology was going to be. I often go back and look at some of those things, and it's amazing to me how good they were at that. But one of the things that I tried not to do was to be very specific in how you should go about it. It's important that you develop a creative approach to that, that you come up with some of your own ideas. So I would give you a starting point. Read widely, talk to an expert. That's not sufficient, but that's a good starting point, and it's going to lead you in a wide variety of areas. And I can't predict what those can be. Time series forecasting won't work there.
Okay, I just have to make a comment to my students. I was in the class where the refrigerator was brought in, or the idea was brought in. It's pretty interesting. Dr. Fair, Frank Fair, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think the forecasting is really a challenge, in particular, because typically if you talk to experts, they're experts in one industry, one maybe product line, and so on. So probably need to talk to several more experts. But then the question is, all right, in adjacent areas, I think sometimes it's a good idea to try to think of what lines of effort are akin to what you're looking at, but aren't in the same stream, because somebody there may be better positioned to see sort of possible growth points. But that's pretty vague, and that's why it isn't very straightforward to give somebody specific directions.
But you would think that they might be able to reach outside the industries that the technology is currently being used in, and see if there's a use in those other
One of the things
industries.
I loved when Vic brought it up was examples of benchmarking, where you don't want to just benchmark against entities within the same line of business. The hospital case that he talks about, where they look going to Formula One racing and say, well, because they recognized an analogy between the handoff processes and the pit stop, and said, we've got to reduce the errors, and here's the way they do it. Ah, gosh, it can work. I mean, it seems to me that's actually a pretty creative vision itself, to be even think that way. So if you're going to forecast, I think part of what you want to do is, in a sense, you find the people in those areas that may be comparable in some respects, but aren't themselves caught up in the industry itself, and see what they have to say.
And from a practical perspective, it makes life much more difficult for you. In talking with the two physicians who came up with the idea of benchmarking the Ferrari racing team, it took them a long time to find a source of grant funds for that. It took them a long time to convince their hospital administration to send them to the Ferrari racing team headquarters in Italy, and then to bring experts from there to the hospital. It was viewed as, you got to be kidding me, kind of a thing. So life is not easy for people who are trying to create the new paradigm. Once you establish a track record, as Steve Jobs did, life becomes easier. But not many of us attain that level of visibility and credibility.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for taking time out of your schedules to come and talk to me about your new book, and to give the students some insight